It's noon, the sun is shining. I'm kind of happy, so let's talk about the ills of imperialism. Welcome back, everybody. It's time to talk Babel by R.F. Kuang. Full spoilers and, well, shortly a non-spoiler thing about this wonderful new book that everyone's been talking about. So for once, I'm actually joining the hype train. Yeah, let's do this, shall we? Cheers. All right, let's do the usual thing, which is I'll give you a quick synopsis what this is all about, and tell you why you should really read it, which you should. And then we'll move on into a spoiler-filled discussion of certain things that I found standing out, which go all over the place. And you can join that discussion whether you want to, if you want. And I'll try to keep like actual plot twists out of the discussion. We will see. So, with all of that said, let's talk about why you should read Babel or the necessity for violence, and then move on. All right, Babel is brand new from this year. It's a historical fantasy novel about early 19th century England and other things. It follows a bunch of students at the Royal Institute for Translation in Oxford that are getting involved, whether they want to or not, into the struggles of the British Empire, that being the beginning of the Opium War, the first Opium War in China. That's sort of the historical backdrop, and it deals with all kinds of elements of how foreign students would feel in an imperialist, racist country like England in the 19th century. It looks at academic life, and it looks at personal struggles of people in that era. It has a solid plot. It has some, good character moments that focus heavily on said, life experience of being a, marginalized group within a more or less terribly chauvinist, racist, and so forth society, and asks those questions like, how does that feel? Is there a way out of it? And what could be that way? It's a very important book right now with all the things going on in the world, and through the methods of fantasy manages to give us an insight into something that we might otherwise try not to actually look at too hard because of our prior, history and identity and whatnot. So, yeah, do yourself a favor, read the book. While it may not be the best book ever written, it certainly has a lot of impact, and I think it's an important book to talk about. With that said, there is very little to trigger warn around here. There is, well, obviously some violence and a lot of racism, so that's baked in. Everything beyond that, however, is fairly plain sailing. I've even seen some people call it YA, which I don't think it is. Anyway, that's sort of what you can get. Go read the book. You really should, and then we can talk about it. All right? You done? Perfect. Then let's talk about Babel by R.F. Kuang, and full of spoilers and not so much full of spoilers. And as always, I've looked at a bunch of things and topics and themes and points that I want to talk about, and we'll see how many of those I still remember now that I'm talking about it on camera. Let's start with the back cover. That's what kind of hooked me to read the book. Back in the, May or whenever pre-orders were opened on Audible, because I did not read The Poppy War. I might, now that I've read this, we will see. But it says, a tonal response to Mr. Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, and a thematic response, or something like that, to The Secret History. And I had already read Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. I do have my issues with the book, but it is, it's well beloved by a lot of people, and there has been some well-deserved praise on it. There has obviously been a ton of praise on The Secret History, which I hadn't read at the time, but it kind of intrigued me, together with the idea of language as a tool for imperialism, which I think is a hugely important topic. So I was like, yeah, I'll pre-order this, whatever, read it. And then I read The Secret History, sort of as preparation for this book, because I try to actually, know what I'm talking about sometimes. And then I went into this. And I think, I don't know who wrote that back cover blurb, whether it was, even authorized by Rebecca Kuang. I don't know. But name dropping two extremely well beloved books or extremely praised books does raise the bar extremely high. In particular, in one level that we need to get out of the way here early on, and that is style. Prose style is what I'm talking about. Because whether you like what they are saying, or whether you like what they are, doing in their novels, both Susanna Clarke and Donna Tartt do know how to write very, very smooth prose in a lot of ways. Like Susanna Clarke, obviously, in Strange and Norrell does replicate a Jane Austen Regency English style of language and does wonders with that. Donna Tartt has just like a very smooth flowing prose. So the problem is, whether you want to or not, and I will come back to what it does on like a thematic level, which I think is really good, you kind of make it very hard for people not to compare your prose, to compare your style with those of Donna Tartt and Susanna Clarke. And yeah, it doesn't work. See, the problem is, this is not a badly written book, but it falls flat in a lot of ways there because there are kind of breaks in the prose. It is still, how to say that? It doesn't flow as smoothly as does Donna Tartt's prose in Secret History, and it does certainly not work as well as a basically Jane Austen rip-off linguistically as does Susanna Clarke's Strange and Norrell. And I think that's a problem because it makes actually looking at what the book does and what the book tries to achieve and absolutely achieves in a lot of places so much harder because everyone's like, yeah, but it's not as good as. It's, the big issue that you have with marketing is like, you raise the stakes too high, you build up too much expectation, you're gonna lead to a lot of anger and inability to actually go and appreciate the text for what it is. So this book is somewhat in that area. But when we leave behind the fact that the actual style is not as impressive as the one in Secret History or the one in Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, we'll get somewhere that is actually really good. One minor thing, the idea of telling the story mostly, except for three interludes, two interludes and the one epilogue, from one perspective, that being Robin's perspective, and making this a third-person narrative, does unfortunately not do too well. I think that's probably the biggest issue I had with this, because, we're following Robin at the university mostly, dealing with all those pressures of university life, being part of an elite group in an elite college, feeling inadequate for it, having that fear of being kicked out. Those are themes that we find in The Secret History, obviously in a different area. But the main issue there is that we get all of that as a first-person narrative from Richard Papin's view in Secret History, which we don't get here. So there's a lot of time spent with Robin thought this, Robin felt this, and it over-explains in that area. Now, as I said, if you think this is a young adult novel, I guess that's fine. And if that was the idea, then probably it succeeds, but just coming off, reading The Secret History recently, and then reading Marlon James' Brief History of Seven Killings, which are first-person narratives, sort of stream of consciousness, impressively done in Marlon James' case, and stuff like that. This feels like This feels like the book is not taking me seriously enough. You know what I mean? It's not, yeah, it feels like being talked down to, which is obviously the danger when you do the whole inner thought world thing and ideas and over explain them in third person. So that's something that really did detract from my enjoyment. Well, enjoyment is probably the wrong word, but it detract me sometimes. When I was like, distract me. It's like, I don't know. I know, I understand how you're feeling, Robin. Don't need to explain that to me once again. Sort of. So that's something that I just wanted to mention as like the biggest failure when it comes to writing, to the way this is done. I think to the narration, that's the big hang up here. It explains too much of the inner workings and feelings and thoughts of its main character, Robin. All right. Now, one thing that I wanted to mention quickly because I really loved it is its way of using references to texts on translation, quotes and stuff like that. That in every quote that is not already written by an English speaker, we get like actually the translation mentioned as well when we have those quick chapter epigraphs and stuff like that. The mention of John Dryden really, really, warmed my heart as someone who has read some of John Dryden's translations of different Greek texts. That was really interesting. John Dryden being one of like a radical Protestant poet, translator, and whatnot during the Civil War era in Britain. He's actually the guy who wrote the eulogy for Oliver Cromwell. So that's a nice thing. But he did translate a lot of Greek classic stuff. The whole like parallel lives of the noble Greeks and Romans. That's his big one. Plus travel stuff. I don't know, morals. That's a lot of stuff that he translated, and there you go. That just like was really interesting to see texts or like authors mentioned that I had read previously for all kinds of dumb reasons. And now let's go into what this book does so extremely well and why I think it works so extremely well. Okay, this is the book about imperialism, about the cost of imperialism, and that dark heart of imperialism where capitalism and racism intersect and become more or less indistinguishable. That's what this book is about, and the personal cost for people trapped in that system. Now, obviously, that's something that I'm interested in. That's something where I get angry about stuff, and Rebecca Kuang does a fantastic job of making people angry. Whether it is through the just like happenings or through like footnotes that explain how incredibly terrible some of those quotes, some of those thoughts at the time were, how hypocritical they sometimes were. It's, if you don't go out of there with like clenched fists and want to punch a 19th century Brit in the face, you've probably done this wrong. But, and I think this is important, the book shows in a lot of ways how those elements are intertwined, how the rise of the idea of free market through Adam Smith, who gets quoted several times, and that like private enterprise driving foreign policy, how that is the one side of the thing, how on the other hand, scholarship with the rise of Orientalism, we have like people, Schlegel and all those German Orientalists and stuff get quoted at the same time, right? How those two elements intertwine to build an ideological basis for imperialism that is cynically moved forward and at the same time exploited by capitalist interests at the same time. And that, I think, is the big strength of it. And the idea of showing that through those four main students, three of them being non-British, non-white characters, noticeably non-British, non-white, with nuances there where someone like Robin can be taken for English in a bad light and does not suffer as much racism as do the other two, having, at the other hand, someone like Letty, a very British person, but a woman, and thus also subject to discrimination, marginalization, try to navigate that very, very specific place where all those external pressures of marginalization basically make human interactions more or less impossible. That is the big strength of this book. Do I wish it would have been done through, first person narratives? Hell yeah, I would. But the idea that in a world where the pressures of racism, of sexism, and so forth exist, those pressures, those external pressures, make human interaction, make friendship and love more or less impossible. That, I think, is a very, very strong point of this novel, that on the micro scale, basically, make much of the power of this book's, the impact of this book be so huge on me. It's like, yeah, you know what? If you try to actually have a friendship with someone who doesn't understand your experience, your background of marginalization, if they don't understand, it will be very, very difficult to ever talk, right? That's something that this book explains, or not explains, but does actually show pretty well. And I did really appreciate that. The other side, obviously, is something like having, Letty be, on the one hand, very much a feminist, so to speak, trying to, prove that women can do what everything men can do, and so forth, is wonderful. But at the same time, as soon as the talk switches to racism, she just doesn't get it, or sometimes maybe even actively promotes the marginalization of non-white people. And that's important, because when you look at the early 19th century and later on, feminist movements at the time were extremely racist and very happy to throw women of color under the bus in order to get some slight improvements for themselves. And that's terrible, but seeing those internal struggles in, with people like Letty in this book, is, I think, a strong point, and one of the strengths of this novel. Now, at the same time, there's much more here that I think is really well explained, or not explained, shown. Obviously, the motives behind the First Opium War, the silver deficit, while there is that magic idea with language, which, it's really cool. You wouldn't even need that magic system necessarily to explain the whole thing, because it was still trade deficits that led to the First Opium War anyway. So we have that without the magic system, but I think the magic system there does help. But to see the general idea that Britain as heart of empire, and this goes for every form of empire and colonialism ever. I mean, even all the way back to like the beginning of the Peloponnesian War, we also see that idea with colonial, issues with like the center of an empire, and the struggle for, not only autonomy, but like actually not being drained by that vampiric center of an empire, right? Anyway, my point is, it does a wonderful job of showing that it's not something that you couldn't learn while reading like a nonfiction book or reading a bit of historiography or whatever. But we tend to figure these things out easier when we have like a personal connection to someone, like a character in a fantasy book. So having that, wonderful, like really, really cool. And now let's move on to the next thing that I think this book does extremely well. And that is the normalization of homosexuality, because there is very clearly a romance between Robin and Rami going on. And it's just normal. It just gets mentioned once or twice, and that's it. But it's great, because it doesn't put it in like the focus. It's just there showing that, humans be humans, and that stuff just happens, and it's great. Anyway, I just wanted to drop that on the side. Let's talk about the language thing. And I think this is a really important thing. Obviously, with her background in linguistics and stuff, that makes a lot of sense. But the idea that language can be used as a tool for imperialism to actually, subjugate other places, that's an important thing that I think I was hoping to get more of that, but it certainly is there, right? You have all these like small bits of people trying to, talking very slowly and loudly to Robin, because they don't expect someone with a Chinese background to be, to understand British English. Whether it is a short reference on like how it is important that people in India learn English to, become more civilized. I mean, those things still show up when we have stereotypes built on dialects and whatnot, when you have, the eradication of Gaelic in Ireland, when you have the eradication, or like the prejudices that are still there when people speak Irish, have an Irish accent, stuff like that. I feel it could have been um, made a bit more explicit, but I guess that might have been just a little bit too much for a book that is already, trying to drag in and unify a lot of different aspects of colonialism and of imperialism in a lot of ways. So maybe I'm asking too much here. And I think that might just be the one weak point where, yes, you have magic based on silver and language, but the main conflict, that being, the imperial aspect, that would have that happened anyway, because, it was just for money. And the elements of the Industrial Revolution, those also happened at the same time because of steam power. And yes, in this world, it may go slightly faster, because of, you know, the silver technology, but that's just all there is. And we even have those elements, Percy Bysshe Shelley getting mentioned about his poems against, in favor of workers' protests and stuff like that. We get all those mentions that are just basically in the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution anyway, but now it just moved a bit faster, I guess. I do see why this happens, because it allows to actually have characters like Robin, Victoire, and Rami show up in England and actually being treated the way they are, as these important tools of imperial. It allows to personify the value of colonies, the cultural value of colonies within an empire. It allows you to personify that in a way that might otherwise have been more difficult. But yeah, if you look at it too hard, it just doesn't really hold up. Apart from that, I like the idea of having that language meaning-based magic system, where you have the idea that there is something untranslatable between words, and that's where meaning sort of resides. And when you actually manage to activate that in some way, you can basically enact that specific, meaning, manifest that in some like physical way that is still hard to describe. But that's a really cool idea, and you could do much more with it. But it doesn't really add that much to the world that we're talking about. So, because otherwise, this is very much indistinguishable from real history in that regard. There's obviously more to be talked about here, so let's do that. And I guess there's some like small inconsistencies where we spend time with, ideas of there being a balcony on the tower. I just have to mention that, because like we spent several chapters talking about like the roof of the building. And then we have like one scene on a balcony that is hard to access to throw over those pamphlets. Like, why did they do that when they could just as well have thrown them off the roof, which might have been even higher and thus even better for their purposes? Where I'm just like, why? But beyond that, the main plotline does mostly make a lot of sense. And we need to talk about the question of violence here in the ending, because I think that's the really important part, and that is that certain systems, and this is, I guess, the important thing here, that's the idea of systematic racism against like personal racism, that is dealt with very well in this book, because while our characters individually do still suffer some racism, they have a lot of privileges compared to other people of their specific ethnicities, right? But the system will still not actually accept them. The system remains racist, and it will crush any opposition in that way, which is why the ending of this book is so incredibly sad, right? It's like there's no way for them to actually live. They can either leave the system or become part of the system or die. And becoming part of the system means giving up their humanity in a lot of ways, their individuality, their identity. That's basically the options you have within a racist capitalist system. And Kuang makes this very, very clear. It might have been slightly clearer if we'd had like any like mention at the end of the book of the fact that, of course, the Opium War still started, so the protest was completely, did not actually succeed in any way. It was basically, I don't want to say meaningless, because obviously it wasn't, but you know what I mean? And so we have this whole idea about the war in China, and they're trying to prevent it and all of that, and then they just die. And then we have Victoire leaving the place, and one mention of like that, yeah, of course, the actual war happened, and the British Empire did get its way in a lot of ways there. That would have been cool to actually have that sort of closure. But I think the idea that imperialism is basically racism driven forward by capitalist needs, and the other way around, capitalism, being driven by racist needs, with almost a religious fervor in there. That is like the key message of this book, and it does deliver that in a lot of ways. And the fact that violence is sometimes the right course of action, because within a system, compromise doesn't work. You have to dismantle the system. You have to actually fully dismantle a system to rebuild it if it is that hostile in a lot of ways. And that point, I think, is really important. One thing that I want to look at as well is the setting up the university and how that is an issue. Because this is one of those things that if you spend a lot of time in academia, you can counter that. The idea of like how much is a terrible system manipulating and utilizing in a lot of ways academia, and how does that interplay with just the love for finding knowledge? Like being a researcher and trying to find out stuff at a university is exhilarating. Finding knowledge is fantastic. It's perfect. And it's very, very easy in that closed off cosmos of microcosm of a university to lose sight of the implications of science and academia. And it's very easy to just like banish them to the side, like, yeah, but I only do pure research, and not be aware of the effects of what one does at university. So Kuang actually making that link explicit, and also showing how, a lot of stuff going on at university is in student identity, student life, academic identity and academic life is somewhat, posturing or just play acting without ever actually, feeling the consequences of one's actions, because it is it is a safe space to explore these ideas, but at some point they need to actually go out in the overall world. And if you've ever spent time at any university, student councils and stuff like that, you know what I'm talking about here. It's like, yes, it's important to do these things there, but there's very few consequences unless you actually go on like a general strike or anything like that. So, I appreciate that in particular when you contrast it back to The Secret History. And that's where I want to end all of this. So, how does it compare to The Secret History in that regard? It does show the negative side of getting caught up in like one's topics, being part of an elite, and having that constant fear of being left behind, because it is a high privilege, and having the fear of having that privilege actually taken away. It does show that aspect. It does show the unhealthy part of, studying in some ways and having that pressure at university. It does show that. It does also manage to very clearly show how far you disconnect from the larger picture once you enter that very specific bubble of academia. And I have to say, there is obviously a point here, which is be aware of that. That bubble of academia still needs to exist. It's important to have that. It's just also important to be aware of that disconnect. And I think the book does a pretty good job of showing those two elements, those two sides of it, and the sheer just like joy of studying it, it does that fantastically well. So, what about Strange in Norrell? Now, obviously, the book Babel does deal with like early 19th century, slightly later than Strange in Norrell, England with a bit of magic in it. And it does something, and this I think is where the tonal response to Strange in Norrell comes in, because where Strange in Norrell does show England as this whimsical, basically lovable place, and does not question the validity or the justifications for going to war when Strange goes to war against Napoleon over there in Spain, I think, and stuff like that. It does feel like how can you write about 19th century England and just ignore all the terrible stuff going on and just focus on like how cool England is and how wonderful magic in England would be. So I do feel a certain rage there, and I think it does a wonderful job of just showing the other side of that. It's like, is England whimsical and wonderful? It's like, yeah, if you're English. If you're English and upper class, it is. If you're either non-white or, poor and not the elite, it kind of sucks a lot. And I feel that response is much stronger than, dealing with the secret history in that regard. And I do appreciate that, and I think it is a necessary book in that area. It really does do a lot here. And I love that. I'm happy with it. All right. So why is this a magic book, a fantasy book, and not just a historical novel or a historical anti-imperialist pamphlet? Well, let me try a metaphor where I quote something from the book. The first element of magic that we find in this book is a silver bar that uses the word treacle. And we later learn that the word treacle and the Latin equivalent is about how you sweeten medicine with sugar. And that, I think, is exactly why this is a fantasy book and not just a historical novel or a history book. There is an important message here about the ills, the harms, the damage of racism and capitalism when they combine into imperialism. Well, and they always do. There is obviously an especially urgent thing here with its hatred on China, which is certainly big at the moment. But all of those are very bitter truths. They are very hard to stomach for all of us. So adding the sweetness of magic to it and adding the, sweetness of fantasy to it does maybe make it a bit easier to stomach those bitter truths, and does hopefully lead to us respecting those perspectives and actually doing something about it. Healing, so to speak. Anyway, that's my thoughts on Babel by R.F. Kuang. I hope you enjoyed the book, or at least learned something from it. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you for watching so much. Like, share, subscribe, join the Patreon if you want. I may knit you a bubbly hat if you want to. Anyway, thanks once again. Cheers.